Picture this moment with me. Soldiers are running, their hearts pounding with fear. In their arms, they carry the lifeless body of a man. The enemy is closing in fast. They need to hide. They need to escape. Now. They spot a tomb. Without thinking, they throw the body inside and run for their lives. But then, something impossible happens. The moment that dead body touches the ancient bones inside that tomb, everything changes. A heart that stopped beating suddenly comes back to life. Lungs that held no breath begin to fill with air. Eyes that saw nothing slowly open. And that man, he stands up, alive. The soldiers freeze in absolute terror and wonder. But here's what nobody talks about. What really happened in that tomb? What hidden power lived in those bones? What did that man feel the exact second life returned to his body? Today, I'm going to reveal every hidden detail of this extraordinary story. You'll discover shocking truths about Elisha, the prophet who performed impossible miracles even after death. And you'll finally understand the mystery that was never told. Are you ready to uncover the truth behind the most incredible miracle in Elisha's life and death? Stay with me. What you're about to discover will change how you see faith forever. Let me take you back to where this story started. We're in Abel Meholah, a quiet farming village in northern Israel. The year is around 870 BC. This was a dark time for God's people. King Ahab ruled the land, and he was one of the worst kings Israel had ever seen. Everywhere you looked, people were worshiping false gods. Baal worship had taken over the nation. The true God was being forgotten. Do you remember Elijah, the prophet who announced a 3-year drought? People were still talking about that with trembling voices. Elijah's name sent chills down people's spines. In this village lived a young man named Elisha. His father, Shaphat, was wealthy and respected. They owned vast lands, large herds, and employed many workers. Elisha wasn't poor, far from it. His family was one of the most successful farming families in the region. As the oldest son, Elisha had one job: continue the family business. Everything was set up for him. His future was secure, but deep inside something was missing. His heart was restless. It was early spring. The fields were turning golden, ready for harvest. The smell of freshly plowed earth filled the air. The sun beat down hot and strong. Elisha was working with the 12th pair of oxen that day. Think about that. 12 pairs meant his family owned at least 24 oxen. They were seriously wealthy. As he guided the animals through the field, his mind wandered. Just another day like all the others, he muttered to himself, wiping sweat from his face. But then he paused. Until when? He whispered, looking toward the distant mountains. The daily routine had stopped satisfying him. There was an emptiness inside, a feeling that his life was stuck between the plow and the dusty road. He'd heard stories of miracles, of prophecies, of men who dared to change the fate of an entire nation. And here he was, day after day, just plowing the earth. Suddenly, a strange wind swept across the field. It was almost cold despite the burning midday sun. Elisha stopped the oxen. Something was about to happen. He could feel it. He looked up and saw a lone figure walking toward him through the heat waves. His heart started pounding. It was Elijah, the prophet from Tishbe, the man who confronted King Ahab face to face, the one who challenged the prophets of Baal on Mount Carmel, the one who prayed and brought rain after 3 years of drought. "It can't be," Elisha whispered, looking around to see if the other workers saw him too. But Elijah didn't care about having an audience. Without saying a single word, he walked straight toward Elisha with steady, purposeful steps. Before we go any further, I need your help. If this story is touching your heart, hit that subscribe button right now. Leave a like to bless this channel and help us bring these powerful Bible stories to more people who need them. Now, let's continue with Elisha's incredible journey. Elijah's eyes burned like fire. They seemed to pierce straight through to Elisha's soul. Without stopping, without hesitation, Elijah took the mantle from his shoulders. In one swift motion, he threw it over Elisha. The heavy mantle fell onto Elisha's sweaty shoulders. Time seemed to stop. Everything went silent. The lowing of the oxen, the singing of birds, even the wind. "Follow me," Elijah said. His voice was deep and rough, but full of absolute authority. Elisha felt his legs go weak. Tears filled his eyes before he even understood why. "Follow you," he repeated, unsure if he was speaking out loud or just in his mind. "Leave everything, my land, my oxen, my family." Elijah didn't answer. He simply turned and started walking away, as if he'd already said everything that needed to be said. Elisha looked at his rough, calloused hands still gripping the reins of the oxen. The weight of Elijah's mantle on his shoulders felt heavier than any burden he'd ever carried. His mind was spinning. "I can't just abandon everything like this," he told himself, trying to convince his own heart. But deep down, he already knew. This was a moment of decision. He ran after Elijah. "Wait," he shouted. The prophet stopped but didn't turn around. "Let me at least say goodbye to my parents," Elisha pleaded, gasping for breath. "Go," Elijah said, his voice even more serious. "But remember, the calling is now. Don't delay." Elisha ran back, his heart racing. When he reached the oxen, he looked at them with tears in his eyes. Without hesitation, he grabbed his axe. With trembling but determined hands, he killed the oxen from the 12th pair. The plow that had been his livelihood for years. He broke it apart and turned it into firewood. Soon, a huge fire was burning in the middle of the field. The smell of roasting meat filled the air. Neighbors and workers came running. "Elisha, what are you doing?" one of them shouted, completely confused. "I'm burning my past," he answered, his eyes fixed on the flames. His father Shaphat came running, alarmed by the commotion. "Son, why are you doing this?" he asked, confused and hurt. Elisha walked over and hugged him tightly. "Because today, God has called me." His mother, with tears streaming down her face, just hugged him without saying a word. As the fire consumed the wood and meat, and as neighbors shared the meal like some strange farewell feast, Elisha looked toward the path where Elijah had walked. He let the mantle fall firmly over his shoulders. With determined steps, he went to meet his destiny. Will he really leave everything behind? What will this choice cost him? The dry ground crunched under Elisha's feet as he hurried to keep up with Elijah's long strides. Dust rose with each step. Elijah walked ahead, his mantle flowing behind him like a battle flag. His face was stern as always. But that morning, there was something different in his eyes. A shadow, as if he carried a burden too heavy to share. Elisha's heart was pounding like a drum in his chest. Ever since he burned the plow and sacrificed the oxen, his life had become unpredictable. And now he felt something was about to happen, something final. One thought kept hammering in his mind. Am I capable of continuing alone? No matter how hard he tried to hide it, fear followed him like a silent shadow. When they reached Gilgal, Elijah stopped suddenly and turned to him. "Stay here, Elisha." His voice was low but full of resolve. "The Lord has sent me to Bethel." Elisha took a deep breath. He'd heard this before. He knew what it meant. "As surely as the Lord lives and as you yourself live, I will not leave you," he answered firmly. His eyes locked on his master. Elijah frowned, studying his disciple for a few seconds. Then, without another word, he turned and kept walking. The journey to Bethel was hard. The sun burned high above. Dust filled Elisha's eyes and throat, but nothing was harder to bear than the fear of losing Elijah. When they reached Bethel, a group of men was waiting. They were the sons of the prophets, apprentices and followers who lived in that city. One of them approached Elisha with a look of pity. "Do you know that today the Lord will take your master from you?" he asked, almost with a tone of provocation. Elisha took a deep breath, struggling to control his irritation. "Yes, I know, be quiet," he answered through clenched teeth. The group stepped back, surprised. Elisha didn't want to hear words of farewell, not now. Once again, Elijah broke the tense silence. "Elisha," he said firmly, "stay here, for the Lord has sent me to Jericho." Elisha's heart raced. "As surely as the Lord lives and as you yourself live, I will not leave you," he repeated without hesitation. Elijah's gaze lingered on Elisha's determined face for a moment. Without saying anything more, he turned and continued the journey. The path to Jericho was long and exhausting. Sweat ran down Elisha's face, but he kept his pace steady, even though his feet ached, even though his body cried out for rest. At Jericho, another group of prophets came out to meet him. "Do you know that today the Lord will take your master from you?" one asked in the same tone as before. Elisha took a deep breath, squeezed his eyes shut, and answered firmly, "I know, be quiet." From a distance, Elijah seemed to smile slightly. No matter how much he tried to distance Elisha, the young man wouldn't give up. After a brief rest, Elijah turned to him once more. "Stay here, for the Lord has sent me to the Jordan." By now, Elisha didn't even hesitate. "As surely as the Lord lives and as you yourself live, I will not leave you." And so they continued to the Jordan River. As they approached the riverbank, Elisha sensed something different filling the air. There was a sacred silence, an invisible expectation. The other sons of the prophets watched from a distance, fearful and curious. Elijah took off his mantle. He rolled it up like a staff. With a firm strike, he hit the waters of the Jordan. The impossible happened. The waters parted, creating a dry path between the two sides. Elisha stood frozen for a second, eyes wide, heart racing. "Let's go," said Elijah, crossing the dry riverbed. Elisha followed, his heart pounding. On the other side, Elijah stopped. The silence seemed to scream. "Elisha," the prophet said with a different look, almost fatherly, "ask what I shall do for you before I am taken from you." Elisha felt his body tremble. This was the moment he had both feared and longed for. He looked into Elijah's eyes. His voice came out with restrained emotion, as if speaking with his soul. "I ask that a double portion of your spirit be upon me." The request echoed through the valley like muffled thunder. For a moment, Elijah just stared at him, as if weighing every word, every intention, every beat of Elisha's heart. "You have asked a difficult thing," Elijah replied seriously but without reproach. "Nevertheless, if you see me when I'm taken from you, it shall be so. But if you do not see me, it shall not be so." Elisha pressed his lips together. His gaze was determined. He wouldn't take his eyes off Elijah, not for a single second. The wind began to blow stronger. Leaves trembled. The sky seemed to take on a deeper color. The air grew heavy. Elisha took a deep breath, not knowing what was coming. But one thing he knew for sure: he would not take his eyes off Elijah, no matter what happened. Will Elisha receive what he desires most? The sun was setting, painting the sky with shades of gold, crimson, and purple as Elisha and Elijah stood by the Jordan River. The place felt charged with energy that could hardly be described. It was as if the very air was electrified by God's presence. In the distance, the sons of the prophets gathered, watching with attentive, curious, and worried eyes. Whispers passed between them, but no one dared speak aloud. Everyone knew this was a decisive moment, a moment when heaven and earth seemed to touch. Elijah stood before the Jordan. His posture was firm, but there was a sad peace in his eyes. Elisha, young and passionate, felt his heart pounding hard. Every step up to this point had been a battle against fear and uncertainty. And now, everything was becoming real. "Elisha," Elijah called, his voice firm yet full of tenderness. "Today the Lord will take me to be with him. This is the end of my earthly journey, but not the end of what God wants to do through you." Elisha swallowed hard, fighting to hold back the emotion threatening to overwhelm him. "I don't want to lose you, my father, my master," he said, almost whispering, his voice choked. "This is not goodbye, but a passage," Elijah answered, extending his hand so Elisha could grasp the mantle resting on his shoulders. Suddenly, the sky seemed to tear open. A whirlwind of fire descended like a flaming tornado, swirling with supernatural intensity. Flames danced in the air, accompanied by winds that lifted leaves, dust, and small branches in a storm of fire and light. Elijah was lifted from the ground by this whirlwind. His body disappeared into the flames that spiraled upward toward heaven. Elisha, with his eyes fixed on the phenomenon, felt his heart tighten with deep pain. my father," he cried out, his voice trembling through tears. "The chariot of Israel and its horsemen." The expression on Elisha's face was that of a man who had just lost his entire world. He fell to his knees, his hands touching the ground, trying to hold onto what had just vanished. The sons of the prophets approached silently, their faces full of reverence and emotion. With a desperate movement, Elisha tore his garments. The sound of fabric ripping echoed through the valley, mixing with the sound of the still blowing wind. "Lord," Elisha pleaded, "don't leave me alone on this journey. Give me the strength Elijah had, the spirit that rested upon him." He wept like a child, the sorrow of farewell mixed with the weight of newly discovered responsibility. In an instinctive gesture, Elisha looked down and saw Elijah's mantle lying on the ground. It was more than just a piece of cloth. It was the inheritance of a prophet, the symbol of authority and power that now rested upon him. With trembling hands, he picked up the mantle and held it tightly against his chest, feeling the weight of the mission that awaited him. "The Lord has chosen me to continue," he murmured, his eyes shining with a mix of fear and determination. He walked to the edge of the Jordan. Looking at the calm waters, he thought about what was to come. He raised the mantle and struck the surface of the river with force. The waters parted, dividing to the left and to the right, creating a dry path. Elisha stood still for a moment, staring at the passage God had just opened. He felt the presence of Elijah's spirit resting upon him like a burning flame. The sons of the prophets approached, one's voice trembling with emotion. Will the spirit of Elijah truly rest upon Elisha? Elisha lifted the mantle, looking toward the sky, now already dotted with stars. "Yes," he said with a firm voice, "for the Lord has chosen me to continue what Elijah began." Tears still rolled down his face, but now they mixed with hope and faith. From that moment on, Elisha knew nothing would ever be the same again. The path ahead would be difficult and full of challenges, but he was prepared to follow. As he crossed the Jordan through the dry riverbed, he felt the warmth of Elijah's fire pulsing within his spirit. Will the spirit of Elijah truly rest upon Elisha? The city of Jericho had a problem, a deadly problem. Known for its ancient history and walls that once withstood sieges and battles, Jericho now lived in silence and suffering. Their main water spring, which should have been their source of life, had become a source of death. The smell of dry earth mixed with the bitter stench of stagnant water. The sound of water trickling from the spring sounded more like a cry than a promise of life. Children coughed constantly. Adults suffered from unexplained pains. Crops withered slowly, as if the land itself was being poisoned by the very water meant to nourish it. Elisha arrived in Jericho that morning with a few disciples and a growing reputation following him. People greeted him with weary looks and cautious hope. Many had lost faith in miracles, but the prophet's presence brought a spark of light. As soon as he entered the city's central square, the elders led him to the spring, a stone-lined well where water was drawn daily. The elders approached with slow steps and faces marked by suffering. "Prophet Elisha," began an old man with white hair and weary eyes. "Our lands are dying. Our seeds won't sprout. Our vineyards wither before their time. But worst of all, our people are falling sick. The young ones, our children and grandchildren, are weak, feverish, and too frail to work." "The water," added another elder. "The water from the spring is bitter. Those who drink it taste poison. Many families mourn their dead, and the doctors don't know what to do." Elisha listened carefully, his heart heavy with the harsh reality before him. He knew this was a crucial moment, not just for the people, but for his newly begun ministry. "Bring me a new, clean bowl and fill it with salt," Elisha commanded with a firm voice. The elders exchanged surprised glances but obeyed, trusting the authority of this man sent by God. Soon, a young woman approached, carrying a bowl filled with pure white salt harvested from the nearby Dead Sea salt flats. The brightness of the salt contrasted with the dryness of the environment. "Prophet," said the elder, "what will you do with this salt?" Elisha smiled gently, with the peace of someone who knows the power of faith. "The Lord will use what is simple and common to transform what is corrupted and poisoned," he answered, approaching the spring. With care, Elisha poured the salt into the stagnant water, watching as the minerals slowly fell and dissolved. For a moment, nothing seemed to happen. The crowd murmured, some doubted, others stared intently, waiting for the miracle. Then a subtle change occurred. The water, once cloudy and dark, began to clear. A fresh scent, almost imperceptible, filled the air, like the smell of rain after a long drought. The first to approach were the sons of the prophets, watching in respectful silence. "It's happening," whispered a young woman, scooping water with her hands. She tasted it, and her face lit up with a radiant smile. "The water, it's sweet," she exclaimed. Soon others began doing the same. People gathered, taking water to their homes, drinking with a mix of disbelief and joy. The elders looked at one another, tears in their eyes. "Blessed be the Lord," cried the oldest elder, kneeling by the spring. "His mercies are new every morning." Elisha, watching the scene, felt satisfaction and responsibility growing in his chest. He knew this miracle, though great, was only the first of many steps he'd have to take to help restore the people of Israel. While the crowd rejoiced, he stepped aside, looking toward the horizon where the sun was slowly setting. "Prophet," said one elder approaching, "if this is the power God has given you, then we know our hope is alive. But tell us, what dangers will we still face? Will the Spirit upon you be enough to deliver us from enemies and trials?" Elisha turned his gaze to the elder, his expression serious. "Faith is not a shield against difficulties, but the light that guides us through them. The Spirit given to me is strong, but the path will be hard. Many will oppose us, some will doubt, and even the people will have moments of weakness." The elder nodded thoughtfully. "Then it's up to us to strengthen that faith," he said. "The Lord has sent you to be the voice and the hand that will lead the change." Elisha smiled gently, feeling both the weight of the mission and the strength of fellowship. As night fell over Jericho and stars began to shine in the clear sky, the prophet knew this victory at the purified waters would be celebrated. But the true challenges were still ahead. Elisha's challenges were only beginning. The narrow path to Bethel wound through gentle hills and dense woods, where the sun filtered through tree canopies, casting golden patches on the dry earth. There walked Elisha, the newly anointed prophet, with a heart full of faith but also unbreakable determination. Since Elijah had been taken by the whirlwind of fire, and Elisha had taken on his mantle and spirit, his life had changed completely. The weight of responsibility was enormous, but he knew he wasn't alone. The Lord was with him, guiding his every step. As he walked, immersed in thoughts about his divine calling and the challenges ahead, young laughing voices began to echo through the trees. At first faint, the voices grew louder until a group of boys appeared, blocking his way. They were youths from Bethel, known for their disrespect and mockery. When they saw Elisha, they began mocking him with loud, contemptuous laughter. "Look who's here," they shouted, their voices dripping with scorn. "Baldy, go up, Baldy, go up." They pointed at Elisha's bare head, laughing and repeating the insult, emboldened by the courage that crowds always give. Elisha stopped, remaining calm. The mockery could wound any ordinary man, but not one clothed with Elijah's spirit. His face stayed peaceful, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. One of the boys, the boldest, stepped even closer and sneered. "Where are you going, Baldy? Afraid to go up? Or do you just like crawling on the ground like a rat?" The laughter multiplied, the insults grew louder. Yet Elisha didn't respond with words or aggression. Instead, he closed his eyes for a moment. He lifted his face slightly toward the blue sky and prayed with a firm, deep voice that rolled through the forest like gentle thunder. "Let the Lord judge those who mock his servant. Let him show his justice before them." A heavy silence fell over the trail. Even the birds stopped singing. The breeze seemed to pause, as if in reverence to the prophet's prayer. Suddenly, from deep within the woods came a terrifying roar. Branches snapped, leaves flew, the vegetation burst open. Emerging like a wild storm, two massive bears charged forward with fury. Their eyes burned like live embers. Their sharp claws sliced the air with a menacing sound. The youths who moments before had been mocking felt panic seize their bodies. They tried to run, but the speed and strength of the bears reached them quickly. Screams of terror echoed through the forest, mixing with the crashing of trees being torn apart. Some youths fell wounded, others fled in desperation, never forgetting the fear of that moment. Elisha remained silent, observing with a calm expression and steady eyes. He knew it wasn't by his own strength that this justice was shown, but by the authority the Lord had given him. When the violence ceased, peace returned to the trail. The few surviving youths, marked by the experience, knelt with voices trembling in supplication and repentance. The people of Bethel, having heard the commotion, arrived at the scene. Upon seeing the prophet standing there, calm and commanding, and the terrified youths, they understood that the Lord had spoken and acted. "How far can the wrath of a prophet go?" some murmured in fear and reverence. "It's a clear warning to anyone who dares defy divine authority," said an elder, looking at Elisha with eyes glowing with respect. Elisha felt a mixture of sadness and resolve in his heart. God's justice wasn't meant to destroy, but to protect his people and maintain respect for his will. Later that night, as he withdrew to his tent, the prophet thought deeply. How far can the wrath of a prophet go? If divine justice, even through his actions, could be this severe, what weight of responsibility still awaited him? Elisha knew he couldn't retreat. His calling was too strong, his spirit inflamed by the Lord's presence. And though the challenges ahead would be enormous, he trusted in the protection and wisdom of the one who had sent him. Inside a simple house with walls of clay and stone that barely protected its residents from the night cold, the air was heavy with despair. A dense silence broken only by the muffled sobs of small children. In that humble home lived a widow with her two sons, survivors of a life marked by loss and hardship. Her husband's recent death had left her without protection and without any way to pay the debts that now threatened to take her sons into slavery, the only way creditors knew to collect what she owed. Elisha had been called there by news of the family's suffering. When he arrived, he found a woman with a face marked by tears and shoulders bowed under the weight of pain. "Prophet," she said, her voice choked with emotion, "my home is on the brink of ruin. I have nothing to pay my debts. If I lose my sons, it will be like losing my very life." Elisha looked deeply into the widow's eyes, seeing the faint flame of hope still fighting against the darkness of fear. "What do you have in your house?" he asked calmly. The woman sighed, glancing toward a corner where a small jar of oil rested, the little that remained after months of hardship. "I have nothing left," she replied, her voice trembling. "Only this small jar of oil." Elisha smiled, not lightly but with firm conviction that was contagious. "Then do this. Go and ask for vessels, many vessels," he ordered. The widow looked at him, surprised almost in disbelief. "Many?" she asked, hesitating. "But where will I find so many?" "It doesn't matter," Elisha replied. "Go and gather all the vessels you can find and let the oil flow." With no other choice, she began collecting containers from her house and from neighbors. She returned with each empty vessel and poured the small amount of oil from the jar that Elisha had blessed. To her amazement, the liquid began to flow without stopping, filling first one vessel, then another and yet another. The oil overflowed and didn't cease. The woman and her sons watched, amazed with tear-filled eyes. News of the miracle spread quickly through the village. Neighbors came to witness the unbelievable scene. Dozens of vessels filled to the brim, one after another, with oil that seemed never-ending. "God does not abandon those who trust in him," said Elisha, his voice carrying the certainty of divine care. As the oil continued to pour, the widow's fear and despair began giving way to hope. The miracle meant she could sell the oil, pay the debts, and save her sons from slavery. But in her heart, a doubt still lingered, a worry that the miracle hadn't fully erased. "Will it be enough to save my family?" she asked, looking at Elisha with eyes full of fear and faith. Elisha gently clasped her hand and said, "Trust in the Lord. He is the God of provision and justice. Today, he has proven that he is with you." That night, as the vessels stood full of miraculous oil, the widow prayed silently, thanking God for the gift that had saved her family and asking for strength to continue the journey that still lay ahead. The miracle of the oil was the first of many that would show the spirit of Elijah truly rested upon Elisha, and that his mission was to transform not only cities and springs, but also broken hearts. Will the oil be enough to save her family? The small house of the widow now had a sweet and unexpected smell, a mixture of hope, gratitude, and the light fragrance of oil that still rested in many jars scattered throughout the room and backyard. Morning light filtered through cracks in the wooden window, gently lighting the corners of the modest home. The floor, once covered with dust and traces of sorrow, was now clean. The space seemed to breathe new air, as if life itself was beginning to renew right there. The widow, her hair already streaked by life's battles, her eyes deep with one who had known pain, sat silently at the wooden table. Her face was peaceful but heavy with emotion. Her children played outside, their laughter filling the air with a melody that seemed to conquer the silence of bitter days. Elisha stood in a corner, watching the scene with a mixture of joy and thoughtfulness. Though his journey was still young, it already carried the weight of many lives he'd touched, the suffering he'd witnessed, and the responsibility he now bore. The widow rose slowly and approached the prophet. Her eyes, once full of uncertainty, now shone with renewed faith. "Elisha," she said, her voice trembling, "I don't know how to thank you. Before, there was the shadow of debt, the threat of my sons being taken into slavery. It all felt like certain and cruel fate. Today, I see a different future because God listened through you." Elisha smiled humbly. "It's not I who act, but the Lord. He is the God of mercy and provision. You only needed to believe." The woman gazed at the prophet with tearful eyes and continued, "I spent sleepless nights feeling fear devour my hope. When everything seemed lost, a small jar of oil was all that remained. Now I see that nothing is small in the eyes of God." Elisha nodded, knowing this miracle represented more than material provision. It was the restoration of trust and faith in God's divine promise. "Your faith is a living testimony," he said, "and God will use it to reach many who still live in despair." Silence settled for a few moments, broken only by the distant laughter of children and the song of birds announcing the new day. Then the widow spoke again, almost as a promise made to herself and to heaven. "I will tell this story everywhere. May the name of the Lord be glorified, and may no one ever again fear losing what he can restore." Elisha looked at her, feeling the flame of hope reignite in his spirit. "And you, woman, be strong and courageous. The Lord walks with you. Your sons will not be sold nor forgotten, for he is just and faithful." The widow smiled, holding the prophet's hand with deep gratitude. Outside, children ran and played while neighbors, curious about the news, began to gather to share in the joy. But Elisha knew his mission didn't end there. The road ahead was long and uncertain. He stood up, adjusting his mantle and taking up his shepherd's staff, the symbol of his divine calling. "I must go," he announced, "for there are many more who need to hear and see the power of the living God." Before leaving, he looked at the widow and added, "Never doubt, even when the storm seems unbearable. The faith you hold is the light that will guide your steps." She nodded, tears in her eyes, knowing this farewell was also an invitation to personal renewal. As Elisha walked away from the village, he felt the wind caress his face like a seal of God's presence upon his journey. Each step was marked by growing confidence, but also by knowledge that greater trials were yet to come. Whispers and rumors about the prophet were beginning to spread. His reputation as a man of God, a man capable of miracles, was reaching the ears of kings and princes who would soon have to face his voice and authority. Elisha walked on, his heart full of faith, fully aware that the prophetic journey is a path between light and shadow, between victory and sacrifice. What new mission would God prepare for the prophet? The house of the Shunammite woman was a vision of peace amid the dry and rugged land. Built with simplicity but much care and love, the small home was adorned with flowers and colorful fabrics that danced lightly in the gentle evening breeze. The scent of dried herbs and freshly baked bread mixed with the coolness of the air, creating a welcoming atmosphere. The Shunammite woman was known for her generosity and hospitality. On every visit, Elisha was welcomed with a sincere smile and a look that overflowed with trust and affection. She was a devoted wife, an excellent homemaker, and to many, a living example of faith and perseverance. Yet despite the peaceful appearance, there was hidden sadness in the woman's heart. She and her husband, after years of marriage, carried a silent and deep pain. They were childless. In that time and culture, the absence of children was a source of anguish and often judgment. The loneliness of waiting had marked their days, casting shadows over their dreams. On a clear morning, Elisha arrived at the Shunammite's house, carrying with him the scent of the earth and the weight of the roads he'd traveled. The woman greeted him at the door with a gentle smile, but her eyes revealed an inner storm. "Man of God," she began, her voice firm but heavy with emotion, "do not play with my hope." She stepped forward, clasping the prophet's hand between hers. "I've cried too many tears for dreams that never came true. If you don't have a true word for me, I ask you to say nothing at all." Elisha looked deeply into the woman's eyes, sensing the sincerity and pain behind every word. "At the appointed time," he replied with a calm yet confident voice, "God will hear your cry. You will embrace a son. The Lord's promise is faithful." The Shunammite woman pressed her lips together, holding back tears that threatened to fall. The weight of waiting and pain seemed to lift, though a thread of doubt remained. In the months that followed, like a seed planted in fertile soil, hope grew. The woman conceived, and news spread through the village, bringing signs of joy and renewal to those who knew her story. Time passed, and when the child was finally born, the home filled with almost tangible happiness. The small house echoed with children's laughter and whispered prayers of gratitude. The Shunammite held her son with tenderness, gazing at his peaceful face. "He is the Lord's gift," she said with a trembling voice, "the answer to my faith and the prophet's promise." Elisha frequently visited the house, watching the boy grow strong and healthy. To him, this child was the living symbol of God's power and mercy. But just as seasons change and life brings its highs and lows, the family's joy wouldn't last forever. One day the boy fell gravely ill. His once rosy and bright face turned pale and weak. The light in his eyes faded, the strength in his tiny hands diminished. The mother, desperate but not without faith, cried out, "Lord, do not forsake me. My son is my life, the promise I received. Guide Elisha to me." The boy died suddenly, leaving the house immersed in deep and silent sorrow. The widow ran to Elisha's house, her heart heavy, carrying her son's cold body in her arms. "No, man of God," she cried with tears streaming like rivers. "Give me back my son. The promise was yours." Elisha, with a serious expression, received the woman and calmed her with words of hope. "God does not abandon his own," he said. "I will go to your house." Upon arriving at the Shunammite's home, Elisha climbed to the room where the boy lay still. The silence was deep, almost suffocating. With a firm voice yet full of spiritual authority, the prophet cried out to the Lord, pleading for the child's life to be restored. The miracle happened. The boy opened his eyes, breathed again. His tiny hand gripped his mother's. Tears of joy and gratitude flooded the room, and the Shunammite's faith was confirmed in an undeniable way. But Elisha knew the journey ahead was still long, and that faith would be tested many more times. Joy doesn't always last forever. The house of the Shunammite woman, which not long ago echoed with laughter and hope, was now wrapped in heavy silence, as if life itself had abandoned that place. The air felt dense, weighed down by loss and despair. The daylight seemed shy as it entered through simple windows, as though respecting the sorrow that now dominated the home. The body of the boy, who for months had been the living promise of a miracle, now lay motionless on the humble bed. His skin, once rosy and full of life, was now cold and pale. His eyes, which had often shone with childhood innocence, were now closed forever, leaving in his mother's heart a wound that seemed beyond healing. The woman sat on the floor, wrapped in a simple mantle, crying in silence. Her tears fell like rivers, soaking the ground in her clasped hands. She felt the pain of a mother who had lost her child, the despair of one who had watched hope die before her own eyes. Yet despite the suffering, faith still lingered within her, fragile but present. She knew there was one last chance, one hope that kept her alive. The prophet Elisha. On that gray and silent morning, the woman set out on her long journey to Elisha's house. Every step was heavy, as if the very ground tried to hold her back. The cold wind cut her face, but she pressed on, driven by a mixture of pain and hope. When she arrived, she found Elisha sitting in his simple room, eyes closed in prayer. He felt the weight of his mission, the responsibility calling him to even greater acts. When he saw her enter, her face marked by suffering, he opened his eyes. The sadness in her gaze spoke more than 1,000 words. "Man of God," her voice faltered, but it carried indomitable strength. "Did I ask you for a son only for him to be taken from me?" That cry struck Elisha deeply. He stood up quickly. With a resolute look, he replied, "Take me to him. I will not allow death to have the final word." The woman nodded, gripping the prophet's arm tightly as they left for the house where the silence of death now reigned. The walk was slow, each step marked by tension and anguished expectation. Upon arrival, the atmosphere wrapped them in a cloak of sadness that felt almost touchable. Elisha entered first, his eyes adjusting to the cold and silent room. There lay the boy, motionless, a vacant presence that devastated hearts. The mother couldn't hold back her tears, but clung to the prophet's hand with desperate faith. "Lord God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob," Elisha cried, kneeling beside the bed, "I plead with you by your mercy and power, restore this boy's life." The prophet stretched out his hands and touched the child's body, feeling the void left by death, but trusting in the Lord's promise. For long minutes, he prayed fervently, each word filled with certainty that God was powerful enough to restore what seemed lost. The mother remained silent, her breath held, her eyes fixed on the prophet and her son's lifeless body. Suddenly, a small movement, a soft breath that brought hope back. The boy's eyes began to open slowly, a faint glow returning to them. His tiny hand stirred hesitantly. His chest rose and fell with the force of renewed life. The woman fell to her knees, embracing her son with a mixture of tears and laughter, pain giving way to uncontrollable joy. Elisha smiled humbly, knowing this miracle was confirmation of God's presence in his mission. But even in that beautiful moment, the prophet's awareness didn't let him forget the trials yet to come, the spiritual battles and sufferings that are part of the journey of faith. As evening light entered through the window, bathing the scene in a golden glow, the prophet thought, "Is it ever too late for a miracle?" The answer, he knew, would always come according to the sovereign will of God. The room where the boy lay dead was small and simple, yet heavy with an atmosphere that seemed to cling to the walls, the air, and even the hearts of those present. The light entering through the window was dim, as if the sky itself had dulled its brightness out of respect for the silence and sorrow filling the space. The boy's body lay motionless on the bed, like a sad statue, a promise of life that had faded away. His mother, seated beside him, held his pale hand tightly, her face marked by anguish and the flickering hope that still sustained her. When Elisha entered the room, an almost sacred silence settled. He didn't say a word upon entering, but his eyes showed the firm conviction of one who knows the impossible is possible for God. The mother looked at him, her pleading eyes searching for an answer. "Please, man of God," she murmured, her voice breaking, "do something. I cannot lose my son." Elisha approached with calm and reverence. He gently placed his hands over the boy's body. In a gesture that went beyond the natural, he lay upon him, pressing his face against the child's. He closed his eyes and lifted a fervent prayer to the Lord. "Lord God of the living and the dead, in this moment when death seems to prevail, we cry out for your mercy and your power. Give life to this boy, strengthen his body, renew his soul. Let your will be shown now, bringing glory to your name." Silence reigned again, but something began to change in the atmosphere. The boy's breath, once non-existent, let out a faint sigh. The mother could hardly believe it. She held her breath, her eyes fixed on that little body now showing faint signs of life. Then the boy sneezed once. The mother let out a sigh of relief, though her faith still trembled. Elisha remained still, silently praying, asking God to continue the work he had begun. Again, the boy sneezed a second time. Those present began to feel growing hope, a flame refusing to die out. The sneezing repeated, a third, fourth, fifth time. Each sneeze felt like a challenge to death, a declaration of life rising against darkness. Finally, at the seventh sneeze, the boy opened his eyes, the once empty gaze now filled with light. He blinked slowly, as if waking from a long sleep, and looked around, finding his mother's face. She let out a cry of joy and fell over him, hugging him with force that seemed to say she would never let him go again. "My son," she repeated, tears of gratitude streaming freely. "He's alive, he's alive." Elisha rose slowly, his expression peaceful and satisfied as others in the room drew closer, marveling at the miracle they'd witnessed. "Glory to God," exclaimed an elder, deeply moved. "This is the power of the Most High who renews life and strengthens the weak." The mother, still embracing her restored son, turned her gaze to Elisha. "Man of God, I have seen with my own eyes the miracle of life. How can I thank you? How can I honor the God who has given me this grace?" Elisha answered humbly, "Give thanks by living in faith, in hope, and in love. The Lord doesn't grant miracles just to amaze us, but to strengthen faith and prepare hearts for what is yet to come." As the boy regained his strength, Elisha reflected silently on the reach of the power working through him. Do Elisha's miracles have a limit? He knew that trials would still come, that the true test of faith often lies beyond visible signs. But in that moment, the certainty of God's presence strengthened him for the journey that would continue. The school of the prophets, a humble and simple place, was the beating heart of Elisha's ministry. There, young disciples sought to learn the mysteries of God's word, training both body and soul to become instruments in divine work. The ancient stone walls echoed with songs of praise, whispers of prayer, and the constant sounds of daily activity that filled that sacred space. It was a place where hunger was more than physical. It was hunger for knowledge, for God's presence, and for the strengthening of faith. That afternoon, after hours dedicated to study and thought, the group gathered to share a meal. The smell of simple stew, made with the few ingredients available, filled the air. The large pot, resting over the crackling fire, promised to satisfy the weary bodies of all present. The atmosphere was calm, almost festive, when suddenly a cry cut through the air like a dagger. "Death in the pot! Death in the pot!" Panic spread instantly. The disciples looked at each other in shock, some frozen, others scrambling to understand the meaning of that terrifying warning. Elisha, who was seated in the corner studying sacred texts, stood up immediately, his face showing a mix of seriousness and concern. "What happened?" he asked, his voice firm and calm, trying to contain the panic threatening to erupt. "Prophet," replied a young man with a pale face, "someone put poison in the food. The stew is contaminated. If we eat, we'll all die." A murmur of fear filled the room. Voices rose, blending horror and disbelief. "We're dying," exclaimed another disciple, desperation evident in his voice. "We don't know who did this, but the danger is real." Elisha walked over to the pot, observing the boiling liquid, now dangerous, that had promised to satisfy the group's hunger. He closed his eyes for a moment, praying silently for guidance and protection. "Bring me some flour," he ordered, looking at the disciples. The young men, though confused, obeyed quickly, rushing to fetch what Elisha had asked for. As they waited, the room filled with tense silence, broken only by the muffled sound of voices trying to stay calm. When the flour arrived, Elisha took a generous portion and threw it into the pot, stirring strongly so it would mix with the poisoned stew. "What are you doing?" asked one of the young men, skeptical. "Won't that make it worse?" Elisha looked at him with a peaceful smile and answered, "Trust in the Lord. He will provide a way where there seems to be none." The next few minutes seemed to drag on. The tension grew as disciples watched the mixture, waiting for something to happen. The smell of the food changed subtly. The color of the stew became richer, almost as if the poison was being neutralized. One of the young men stepped forward and cautiously tasted the food, feeling the flavor shift, becoming more pleasant. It's good," he exclaimed, relieved. Soon others tasted it as well, and fear began giving way to growing gratitude. "Glory to God," cried one of the elders present. "He is our refuge and strength, a very present help in times of trouble." As the group ate, Elisha remained silent, reflecting on life's fragility and the constant need for divine intervention to protect his people. In that school where young men sought knowledge and holiness, there was also the constant reminder that spiritual battle existed in every area of life. Who else out there might need immediate rescue? Elisha thought, aware that this miracle was only one step on his long journey. The threat of the poisoned stew was a warning to him, a sign that his mission would face hidden and dangerous forces, and that faith would need to remain firm and constant to prevail. As the fire beneath the pot burned gently, the fire of faith burned even stronger in the heart of the prophet and his disciples. The future was uncertain, but the certainty of God's power strengthened them to face any challenge. On the banks of the peaceful Jordan River, a group of disciples worked hard on a simple yet essential task: building a shelter to house the students of the school of the prophets. The morning sun shone brightly, reflecting on the calm, crystal-clear waters, while a gentle breeze swayed tree branches softly, bringing a sense of peace to that corner of the land. The planks were being cut and shaped with effort. The axes, basic but absolutely necessary tools, echoed rhythmically against the wood. It was a labor of patience and perseverance, a show of unity and commitment of those men to God's work. Among them, Elisha supervised the activity, his eyes attentive, his spirit watchful. He knew that just like in manual labor, ministry required dedication, care, and above all, faith. But suddenly, the peaceful atmosphere was interrupted by an accident. One of the disciples, a young man, restless and perhaps still inexperienced, was handling the axe with less caution than he should. At the moment of splitting a log, the axe head slipped from his hands and fell with a loud splash into the deep waters of the Jordan, quickly sinking and disappearing beneath the waves. "Oh no, my lord," the young man cried out, his face pale with anguish. "It was borrowed, it wasn't mine, I can't lose it." A heavy silence fell over the group. Losing the axe wasn't just a material loss, it threatened the continuity of the work, a problem with no simple solution. Elisha approached calmly, his gaze firm and compassionate. "Where did it fall?" he asked, showing no hurry, as though he already knew the answer would come, even in the face of difficulty. The disciple pointed to the exact spot in the water where the axe had sunk. The calm, mirror-like waters seemed to mock the young man's distress. "Come, let's try to recover it," Elisha ordered, and everyone moved closer to the riverbank. But no one dared step into the water, afraid the object was lost forever. Then the prophet picked up a piece of wood. With a firm gesture, he threw it toward the spot indicated. "Where the iron fell, the iron shall float," he said like a whispered promise. Taking a longer branch, he dipped it into the water and began to stir gently. Then, to everyone's amazement, the axe head began to rise from the depths, miraculously floating to the surface. The disciples burst into exclamations of awe and joy. "Glory to God," exclaimed one of them. "The Lord watches over his works, even the smallest ones." Elisha took the axe, washed it, and handed it back to the young disciple. "Do not fear losing what God has entrusted to you," he said with a smile. "For everything that belongs to God is under his protection." The young man, still trembling, thanked him with tears in his eyes. Not just for the recovered axe, but for the deep lesson he'd just learned. "If God cares for an axe," Elisha continued, gazing toward the horizon, "what more will he do for those who serve him with faith and humility?" The group remained silent, reflecting on the magnitude of what they'd just witnessed. They knew this miracle wasn't merely about a lost and recovered object, but a divine message about God's care, provision, and power. As the sun rose higher in the sky, lighting the banks of the Jordan, Elisha felt within his chest a renewed sense of the mission he carried. Each day would bring challenges, but also miracles and proofs of God's constant love. And now the question echoed clearly and urgently in his thoughts. If God cares for an axe, what more will he do? Twilight slowly fell over the city of Dothan, painting the sky with fiery shades of red and orange that blended into the deep blue of approaching night. The air was thick with tension that could be felt in the hearts of everyone there, the residents, the disciples, even Elisha himself. The sounds of the city, usually peaceful, were now silenced, as if the very environment recognized the weight of the moment. In the distance, a constant metallic rumble heightened the anxiety of the inhabitants. It was the sound of the Syrian armies surrounding Dothan. Thousands of soldiers, imposing horses, heavy chariots, all taking positions around the walls ready to crush any resistance. Inside the walls, people gathered, watching the watchtowers and locked gates with fear. Women held their children close. Elders murmured silent prayers, trying to keep hope alive in the face of overwhelming threat. Among them, Elisha remained calm, observing the enemy camp with eyes that could see beyond visible reality. At his side, one of his youngest servants, newly arrived and still inexperienced in the dangers of spiritual warfare, was visibly shaken. "Oh my Lord," the young man cried out, his voice breaking with fear. "We are surrounded by a vast army. How can we resist? What can we do against such force? I see no way out." Elisha turned to the young man with a look full of peace and confidence. "Those who are with us are more than those who are with them," he said, his voice firm and full of conviction. The young man shook his head in disbelief. "Master, I don't understand. We are surrounded. They have thousands of men, horses, war chariots. We are few and poorly armed. How can you say we are more?" Elisha smiled gently, recognizing the natural doubt of his disciple, but knowing that in that moment he needed to strengthen his faith. "Open your eyes," he commanded. Confused, the servant lifted his eyes to the prophet, then to the walls and the valley beyond. Then, as if an invisible curtain was lifted from his eyes, the vision changed. Instead of the enemy camp, he saw a magnificent and terrifying scene. The hills surrounding Dothan were filled with horses and chariots of fire. A heavenly legion shining under the twilight light, ready to protect the children of Israel. The armies of heaven surrounded the city. Their weapons gleamed with supernatural light. Their warriors stood ready for battle. The servant fell to his knees, his mouth open in a mixture of awe and reverence. "Lord," he whispered, tears filling his eyes, "who are these who guard us?" Elisha placed a hand on the young man's shoulder. "They are the angels of the Lord, sent to protect his people. The battle we fight here is not against flesh and blood, but against spiritual forces. The war is already won in the invisible realm." As night advanced, the Syrian army tried to march against Dothan. But a cloud of confusion and disorientation fell upon them. Their eyes were darkened, their minds clouded. They attacked each other, lost and terrified. The confusion grew so great that before dawn, the Syrian army broke camp and fled, leaving behind weapons, chariots, and supplies. Inside the walls, the people celebrated a victory that seemed impossible. Songs and dances filled the streets. News of divine protection spread like wildfire. Elisha watched everything with humility, knowing this battle was just one of many still to come. Has the war really ended? He thought. The enemy never rests and faith must be strengthened day by day. He knew the real battle was for the soul of the people, for their faithfulness to God in difficult times, and that his mission would require courage, wisdom, and constant dependence on the Lord. As the sun rose, lighting the green fields surrounding Dothan, Elisha felt a renewed calling. The Lord, who had opened the servant's eyes to the heavenly reality, was now preparing him to face the challenges yet to come. More than horses and chariots of fire, it was faith that needed to remain unshakable. The sun was setting over the city, as Elisha's house prepared to receive a visitor unlike any who had ever crossed his path. He was neither a young apprentice nor a simple villager. He was Naaman, commander of the army of the king of Syria, a respected, feared, and powerful man. Yet despite his position and strength, there was a deep shadow over his life. Leprosy, a cruel disease that isolated him and forced him to live with shame and fear. news of Naaman's arrival was met with curiosity and unease. The prophet, however, waited for him with patience and faith in the Lord's action. The commander's servants were also anxious, knowing this visit could change their master's destiny. When Naaman arrived at Elisha's house, he was received in a simple yet respectful manner. The commander, used to luxury and power, felt uncomfortable in the prophet's humility. Yet the hope of healing pushed him forward. But when Elisha sent a message through his servants, instructing Naaman to wash himself 7 times in the Jordan River, pride and disbelief filled the commander's heart. Naaman, sitting in his chariot, received the message and reacted with anger. "Aren't the rivers of Damascus better than all the waters of Israel?" he questioned, his voice filled with contempt. "Wouldn't it be more dignified to wash in them and be clean? Why should I bathe in the Jordan?" His servants, worried about their master's attitude, tried to persuade him. "Master, if the prophet had asked you to do something difficult, wouldn't you have done it? Why then hesitate before such a simple instruction?" The commander, still resentful, resisted for a time. But the servant's insistence and wisdom won. They convinced him to at least try what Elisha had ordered, if only not to miss the chance of being healed. The next morning, Naaman approached the Jordan, accompanied by his servants. The river, calm and seemingly ordinary, wound its way through the landscape with clear waters and a gentle current. But for Naaman, that river represented an unexpected challenge, a test of his faith and humility. Reluctantly, he stepped down from his chariot and dipped himself into the waters of the Jordan for the first time. The coldness of the water surprised him, awakening sensations he hadn't felt in a long time. He rose to the surface, but felt no change. Immersed in thought, he repeated the dive 6 more times, each with renewed hope and a bit more doubt. When he emerged from the 7th immersion, he looked at his hands and arms. The skin, once covered with spots and leprous sores, was now clean, smooth, and healthy. The miracle he'd waited for all his life had finally happened. Naaman's heart raced. He knelt at the riverbank, tears filling his eyes, and lifted his hands to heaven, praising the God of Israel. "Now I understand," he proclaimed with a trembling voice. "There is no God but the God of Israel. He is true and powerful." Meanwhile, Elisha, back in his house, learned of the miraculous healing and prayed, giving thanks to the Lord. Yet even in the face of that victory, he knew God's power wasn't limited to this physical healing, that greater miracles and even greater challenges were still to come. The fame of the miracle began to spread, causing both admiration and envy and opposition. Elisha needed to be prepared to face not only natural forces, but also spiritual ones and those that came disguised in human form. Would an even greater miracle soon come? Years had passed since the prophet Elisha had departed from this world. His body lay silently in a small grave dug into the earth near the village where he'd spent his final days. Despite the silence of the tomb, his presence remained alive and powerful among the people. Stories of his miracles and unshakable faith were told with reverence, passed down from generation to generation. The flame of his ministry had not gone out. Many still sought inspiration in that man of God who had transformed lives, cities, and even nations. However, time had not brought peace to the land. Syrian invaders surrounded the region, spreading fear and destruction. People lived through times of uncertainty and constant danger, knowing that at any moment they could lose everything they had, even their own lives. Amid this tense atmosphere, a shocking incident was about to occur, revealing a power no one imagined. On a cold afternoon, a chariot rushed into the small village that surrounded Elisha's tomb. Inside it lay a dead man, a young soldier who'd been gravely wounded in battle against Syrian enemies. His lifeless body was brought for a quick burial, as there was no time for ceremonies or long mourning. The enemy siege made haste essential. Frightened villagers quickly opened the grave, where Elisha had been buried years before. It wasn't customary to use that site for common burials, but the urgency was great. With trembling hands, they placed the young soldier's body into that sacred tomb, covering it with damp earth, hoping only to bury him and flee before the enemy arrived. As some were still placing the final layer of soil, the sounds of hurried footsteps and alarmed voices echoed through the village streets. The siege was drawing near. Everyone knew they had to leave at once. Suddenly, a scream of surprise and fear shattered the silence. "Look, the dead man is moving." Everyone turned toward the grave, where the once motionless body began to stir slowly. The cold hand of the soldier touched the bones of Elisha, which still rested there, silent testimony of the prophet who once was. What happened next seemed like an impossible miracle, a scene straight from the most ancient biblical times. The lifeless body abruptly sat up, his chest rising and falling with the force of renewed life. The eyes, once closed forever, slowly opened, absorbing light and reality with a mixture of confusion and recognition. Murmurs of astonishment and reverence began to rise among the crowd, many falling to their knees with tears in their eyes, others simply watching in silent awe, fearing to miss the moment. "Glory to God!" exclaimed an elderly man, his face glowing with unshakable faith. "Even the prophet's bones carry the power of the Most High." That moment went beyond death itself. The power that had once been shown in Elisha's life now radiated from his bones, showing that the eternal life granted by God knows no limits. The man, now alive, stood up from the grave, gazing at the faces surrounding him. Though disoriented, he was fully aware that he'd been given a second chance, a miracle that would forever change his story. At that moment, an elder stepped forward, his voice echoing with wisdom. "If even the bones of the man of God held life, what more can the living God do in your life today? He is the God of the impossible, the God who resurrects, transforms, and renews." The words sank deeply into the hearts of all present. The miracle was more than a sign. It was a call to unshakable faith, to hope that endures even in the face of death, and to the certainty of the Creator's sovereign power. As the crowd scattered under the star-filled sky, every soul there knew they'd witnessed something unique. A fragment of God's glory revealed on earth. Elisha, even in his physical absence, remained a channel of divine grace, a bridge between heaven and earth, whose authority would never be forgotten. Yet that miracle also brought a profound reflection. If Elisha's bones could transmit life, what could be the reach of God's power in each person's life? Could it be that even in the darkest moments, God was ready to touch, restore, and transform? The answer lay in faith, in total surrender to the Lord, and in the trust that His mighty hand never fails. As silence settled once again, a final vibrant and challenging question echoed in every heart. If even Elisha's bones held life, imagine what God can do in your life today. As we close the pages of this journey through the life and ministry of the prophet Elisha, we're invited to reflect on the profound lessons his path offers us. An ordinary man who began his journey in the simplicity of a wheat field and became a powerful instrument in God's hands, capable of performing miracles that defy human logic and touch even the hardest of hearts. Elisha wasn't born a prophet in golden thrones or majestic palaces. His origin was humble, a farmer's son, working the soil under the scorching sun with hands made rough from daily labor. Yet it was from this simplicity that God chose to shape a pure vessel, ready to be filled with His Spirit. This choice reminds us that God doesn't look at appearances or external conditions, but at a heart willing to obey and trust. He works through ordinary lives, transforming them into channels of His glory. Simplicity can be the cradle of divine power. Throughout his journey, Elisha faced trials, losses, rejection, and even death. As we saw in the climax of the story, the death of the Shunammite son, the enemy siege, the daily challenges of leading people and confronting opposing forces were not barriers that couldn't be overcome. They were steps that strengthened his faith and deepened his dependence on God. Suffering wasn't the end, but the path to redemption and miracle. This teaches us that our pains and struggles, no matter how intense, can be transformed into living testimonies of God's redeeming power. Elisha's miracles reveal God's immense compassion. From purifying bitter waters to raising the dead, from saving disciples from imminent dangers to healing the leprosy of the foreign commander Naaman. Each act demonstrates a God who is attentive, who cares about life's details, about individual and collective suffering. This compassion invites us to trust, to surrender our lives and circumstances to the Lord's loving care, knowing that He is at work in our most difficult moments, even when we cannot see it. Though times have changed, the God of Elisha remains the same. A living God who performs miracles, opens paths where there are none, heals deep wounds, and transforms lives for His glory. His power isn't confined to the past or to the stories of the Bible. He acts today in our families, our communities, and in our very own lives. All it takes is to believe, to seek, and to obey. Elisha's legacy isn't only in the miracles he performed, but in the example of faith, courage, and obedience he left us. He teaches that, regardless of circumstances, God calls each of us to a mission. We may not bear the title of prophet, but we have the opportunity to be instruments of divine love and power in our own time. Now, the question that remains for each of us is profound and personal. What will be your next step of faith? Are you willing to leave behind your securities, to fully trust the Lord, and allow Him to work miracles in your life? Will you choose to look beyond difficulties, doubts, and fear and move forward, confident in the direction of His divine calling? May Elisha's story be the light that illuminates your path and the strength that sustains your journey. Remember, the God who raised the dead, who purified bitter waters, and who made an axe head float is the same God who wants to act in your life today. The next chapter of your story is in your hands, guided by the faith you choose to live. May this legacy inspire and transform lives. And may each step taken in faith be a response to the infinite love of our God. If this story touched your heart and strengthened your faith, don't keep it to yourself. Hit that subscribe button right now and turn on notification so you never miss another powerful Bible story. Leave a like to help us reach more people who need to hear these life-changing truths. And share this video with someone who needs a miracle today. Your simple action could be the beginning of someone's transformation. Which Bible character should we explore next? Drop your suggestions in the comments below. Remember, God is writing your story right now. What will your next chapter be? 2 more incredible Bible stories that will blow your mind are appearing on your screen right now. Click to watch them and discover more about God's amazing power and faithfulness. Don't forget to subscribe and leave your like. May God speak to you powerfully, even in the most difficult moments of your journey. See you in the next video.